The obsidian floor is cold beneath my knees, and I cannot stop shaking. Not from fear, not anymore. Something else has taken root in me tonight, something warm and terrifying that has nothing to do with the throne room's chill or the eyes of the court pressing against my back like blades. My palm rests low on my stomach, and beneath it, faint as a moth's wing, I feel it again. A flutter, a secret, a miracle that should not exist inside a body like mine. I am Nate Wong, and 3 moons ago I did not believe in miracles. I did not believe in demon lords who bled real blood, or omegas who could carry something more than shame, or love that could grow in a fortress built from screams. But I am kneeling in the court of Ashvale with my forehead nearly touching the floor, and the only thought looping through my mind is, how do I tell him? How do I tell Brian King, the demon lord who is said to have no weaknesses, that he has one now, curled beneath my heart, smaller than a fingernail and already more powerful than every soldier in his army? They call him the Undefeated. They call him the Devourer of Kingdoms. They call him a monster whose name mothers use to frighten children into obedience. I have heard soldiers whisper that he tore down the ivory spire with his bare hands, that he does not sleep, that he has never once shown mercy to an enemy or affection to an ally. I used to believe every one of those stories. Then I met his eyes. Not the eyes the world sees, the ones that glow like dying embers when his temper rises, the ones that have made grown generals drop their swords and beg. I mean the eyes I see in the dark, after the candles gutter out, when it is only the 2 of us and the low hush of his breathing against my hair. Those eyes are not the eyes of a monster. They are tired. They are lonely in a way that makes my chest ache. They are, impossibly, soft, only for me. I press my hand flatter against my stomach and close my eyes, willing my pulse to slow. The court has already left the hall. Even the guards have gone, dismissed with a flick of Brian's clawed hand and a growl that sent them scattering like startled crows. It is only the 2 of us now, him seated on that great black throne carved from the bones of something no longer living, and me kneeling at the base of the dais because that is where an Omega is meant to kneel, even one who has been claimed, even one who has been loved in ways that have nothing to do with duty. Nate. His voice rolls through the hall like distant thunder, low and rough, threaded with something that might be concern if I did not know better than to hope for it too loudly. I lift my head. He is watching me the way he always does, like I am a puzzle he has not yet finished solving, like I am dangerous and precious in equal measure. You've been kneeling there long enough, he says. Come here. I do not move right away. My mind is still catching up to what the healer told me only hours ago, her voice trembling as she pressed cool fingers to my wrist and confirmed what I already suspected in the deepest, most frightened part of myself. You are carrying, my lord's Omega, a child, his child. I remember the way her hands shook harder than mine. I remember the silence that followed, thick and terrified, because in the court of Ashvale, an Omega carrying a demon lord's heir is not celebrated. It is watched, it is weighed. It is, depending on who you ask, either a blessing or a war waiting to happen. Nate. This time his tone sharpens, worry breaking through the command. He rises from the throne in one fluid motion, robes of black and crimson sweeping around legs longer than any mortal man's, horns catching the torchlight as he descends the steps toward me. You're pale. What's wrong? I want to tell him. The words are right there, pressing against my teeth, aching to be spoken. But I am so afraid of what will happen to that ache in his eyes once I do. Afraid it will curdle into something colder, something political, something that measures the child before it measures me. I have seen him calculate 1,000 things in the span of a single breath. I do not know if I can bear to watch him calculate this. He kneels in front of me instead of making me rise to him, which is its own kind of miracle. The demon lord Brian King, who does not bow for kings or gods or the dying pleas of his enemies, kneels on the cold obsidian floor and takes my face between hands large enough to crush a man's skull. Hands that have never once hurt me, not even by accident. "Say something," he murmurs. "You're frightening me." I almost laugh at that, frightening him, as if anything in this world could frighten a creature built from shadow and old, terrible magic. But then I remember the flutter beneath my palm, the secret curled inside me, and I understand. Some fears have nothing to do with strength. Some fears are made entirely of love. "I'm not sick," I whisper finally, my voice cracking down the middle. "I'm not dying, I promise you that." His thumb brushes my cheekbone, wiping away a tear I did not know had fallen. "Then what is it?" I take his hand. The same hand that has ended lives without hesitation. And I guide it to rest against my stomach, right over the place where the flutter lives. For a long moment he does not understand. His brow furrows, confusion flickering through those ember eyes, and then understanding arrives all at once, like a wave breaking over stone. His breath stops. I watch it happen. The exact instant the demon lord of Ashvale, the undefeated, the devourer of kingdoms, forgets entirely how to breathe. To understand why that silence terrified me more than any battlefield could, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to the night I arrived at Ashvale in chains that were never truly meant for me. I was not born to this court. I was born in a village so far from the obsidian spires that most of its people did not believe demon lords were real, only stories parents told to keep children from wandering past the tree line after dark. I was an Omega in a family that considered that word a curse rather than a nature, and when the tithe collectors came demanding tribute for the new demon lord who had just crushed 3 kingdoms in a single season, my family did not hesitate. They handed me over before the collectors had even finished speaking his terms. I do not blame them anymore. I did for a long time. I lay awake in the cart that carried me toward the spires, wrists raw from rope, and I hated every one of them with a heat that felt like it might burn me alive from the inside. But hatred is heavy, and eventually I set it down, because I needed both hands free to survive whatever waited for me at the end of that road. What waited for me was worse than I imagined, and then, impossibly, it became the best thing that had ever happened to me. The court of Ashvale rises out of black rock like a wound in the earth, spires twisting toward a sky that always seems bruised with storm clouds, even when the weather elsewhere is calm. I remember being marched through gates taller than my entire childhood home, past guards with skin the color of ash and eyes like coals. Past courtiers who looked at the tribute of Omegas being paraded before them the way a butcher looks at livestock. I remember thinking quite clearly that I would die there. Not immediately, perhaps, but eventually, forgotten. Another body added to whatever pile the demon lord kept his conquests in. Then he entered the hall. I had heard the stories. Everyone had. But stories are pale, bloodless things next to the reality of Brian King striding into a room. He is, enormous in a way that should have been grotesque and instead was simply overwhelming. All coiled muscle and dark horns curving back from his temples like a crown he had never asked for. His eyes found the line of trembling Omegas immediately, sweeping over us with an expression I could not read, and I remember feeling, for one absurd heartbeat, that he looked exhausted, not cruel. Exhausted, the way a man looks after carrying something heavy for far too long. He did not choose me that day. He barely looked at any of us for longer than a breath before turning to his steward and issuing some quiet, clipped instruction I did not catch. We were led away to be housed in the Omega quarters, gilded, comfortable, and utterly without the freedom to leave. I told myself that was fine. I told myself invisibility was survival. It was 3 weeks before he spoke to me directly, and even then, it was an accident of circumstance rather than intention. I had wandered further than I was permitted, drawn by the sound of rain against a garden I did not know existed within the fortress walls, and found myself standing in a courtyard of black roses, with nowhere to hide, when the demon lord himself walked through the archway alone, without his guards, without his court. I remember freezing. I remember thinking he would kill me for the transgression of simply existing where I should not have been. Instead, he stopped several paces away and studied me the way you might study weather you cannot predict. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. His voice was quieter than I expected. Rough, yes, but not the growl of legend. "I know," I managed. "I'll go. Stay." A word came out almost like it surprised him too. He looked away, toward the roses, jaw tight, as though he regretted speaking at all. The roses only bloom like this when it rains. No one else bothers to notice. I did not know what to say to that. I still do not fully understand why he said it. Why the most feared creature in 3 kingdoms chose that moment, that quiet garden, to reveal something so unguarded to a frightened tribute, Omega, he had never spoken to before. But I stood there with him in the rain, both of us silent, both of us watching, black petals catch water like tears. And something in my chest loosened that had been clenched tight since the day the collectors took me from my family. I did not fall in love with him that night. That would take much longer, and much more courage than either of us possessed in that first fragile hour. But something began there, in the rain, among the roses that only he seemed to love. I did not know yet that the roses were the only soft thing he allowed himself. I did not know I would become the second. After the garden, everything shifted slowly, the way seasons change, imperceptible day to day, undeniable in hindsight. He began finding reasons to pass through the corridor near the Omega quarters. He began sending for me under thin pretexts, questions about my homeland, requests that I read to him from old, dust-choked histories. His advisors were too busy to bother with. Silences that stretched long and comfortable rather than awkward. His court noticed before I let myself admit what was happening. I caught the whispers in hallways, saw the narrowed eyes of courtiers who had spent decades trying to win even a scrap of the Demon Lord's attention, and watched a nameless tribute Omega collect it without even trying. I was afraid of that attention long before I learned to want it. Ashvale is not a gentle place. The Demon Lord's court is built on old blood and older grudges, and every kindness shown to an Omega like me is measured, dissected, weaponized by those who see affection as a door left open to exploit. I remember the first time one of his generals, a broad-shouldered creature named Voss with a voice like grinding stone, cornered me in a stairwell to remind me quite plainly that Omegas who forgot their place tended not to last long in this court, regardless of whose favor they briefly held. I did not tell Brian about that conversation. I did not think he would care, not then, not when I still believed myself disposable to him, despite the strange warmth blooming between us. I was wrong about that, though it took an unrelated cruelty to prove it. It happened during a feast held to celebrate a border victory, some territory annexed, some minor kingdom folded into Ashvale's ever-expanding shadow. I was seated far from the head table, as was proper for someone of my station, watching candlelight flicker over polished black stone, and trying to make myself small enough not to be noticed by anyone who mattered. It did not work. A courtier. I never learned her name, and I have chosen not to seek it out since. Decided I made an amusing target for the evening's cruelty. She said things about Omegas from villages like mine. She said things about tribute, about how little we were worth beyond what our bodies could be used for. She laughed, and others laughed with her, and I sat there with my spine locked rigid and my eyes fixed on my plate, refusing to let them see how deeply the words landed. I did not notice Brian rise from the head table until the entire hall went silent. He crossed the distance between us in a handful of strides, and when he spoke, his voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It filled the hall the way a coming storm fills the sky, total, inescapable, undeniable. "Say it again," he said to her, "so I can decide exactly how much of your tongue you'll be keeping afterward." The color drained from her face so quickly I almost pitied her. She stammered an apology that he did not accept, did not even acknowledge before turning his back on her entirely and extending a hand toward me in front of the whole court, in front of generals and advisors and every gossiping tongue in Ashvale. "Come," he said, "you'll sit beside me for the rest of the feast." I remember staring at that hand like it might be a trap. I remember the roar of blood in my ears, the disbelief tangled up with something warmer, something that felt dangerously like hope. I took his hand. I let him lead me to the head table. Let him seat me at his right side in full view of every courtier who had ever doubted my worth, and I understood in that moment that whatever this was between us had already grown too large to hide. He did not apologize for the display afterward. He did not explain it either. He simply reached over once the feast resumed and the hall's attention scattered back to its own gossip, and rested his hand briefly over mine on the table, a small gesture barely noticeable to anyone not looking for it, but unmistakable to me. "No one speaks to you like that again," he said, quiet enough that only I could hear. "Not in my court, not anywhere I have breath to stop it." I did not answer him. I could not. I simply turned my hand beneath his and let our fingers lace together beneath the table, hidden from the court, but not from each other. And I thought, for the first time since the tithe collectors dragged me from my home, that perhaps I had not been delivered into a cage after all. Perhaps I had been delivered somewhere I might, impossibly, choose to stay. The bond mark came 4 months after that feast, on a night I still return to whenever I need to remember that gentleness and power are not opposites. Omega bonds are not casual things. They are not decorations or declarations made lightly, because once given, they cannot be undone. Not fully, not without a grief so total, it hollows out whatever remains of the person left behind. I knew that. I had grown up hearing warnings about bonded omegas whose mates had died, how some withered afterward, how the tether between two souls could become a wound instead of an anchor. I did not bring any of this up when Brian first asked me quietly, in the dark of his chambers, whether I wanted one. "You don't have to answer tonight," he told me, tracing slow, careful lines along my shoulder where the mark would go. "I won't ask again if the answer is no. I need you to understand that. I will not press you toward this." "Why are you offering it at all?" I asked. Demon lords did not bond omegas. They kept them, used them, occasionally favored them, but the bond was something else entirely. A vow, a vulnerability, a permanent thread connecting two lives in a way that could be exploited by any enemy clever enough to find it. I knew enough of Ashvale's politics by then to understand exactly how dangerous that vulnerability would be for a demon lord as powerful and as hated as Brian King. He was quiet for a long moment. When he finally answered, his voice had dropped into something rawer than I had ever heard from him. "Because I have spent 300 years being told I cannot be hurt," he said. "Because I have built this entire court, this entire reputation, on the idea that I have no weaknesses left to exploit. And then you arrived in chains you didn't deserve, and you looked at roses in the rain like they mattered, and I have not had a single peaceful night since." "That sounds like a complaint," I whispered. "It's not." His hand stilled against my shoulder. "It's the truth. I have a weakness now, Nate. I have had one since that garden. The bond wouldn't create it. It would only be honest about what already exists." I did not answer him with words. I turned into his chest, pressed my lips to the scar over his heart. A scar he had never explained, and I had never asked about. And I told him, without needing language for it, that I wanted the bond. I wanted to be his honesty. I wanted to be the truth he had been hiding from the rest of the world. The mark itself did not hurt the way I expected. There was a sharp instant of pain when his teeth broke skin at the junction of my neck and shoulder, followed immediately by a flood of warmth that felt less like injury and more like recognition, like something in my blood had been waiting its whole life to finally answer a question. I felt him in a way I had never felt anything before. Not just his hands or his voice, but the low hum of his presence settling into some previously empty room inside me, filling it, staying. Afterward, he held me like I might disappear if he loosened his grip even slightly, his face pressed into my hair, his breathing unsteady in a way I had never once witnessed from him, not in battle reports, not in political negotiations, not even in the aftermath of the feast, when he'd threatened to remove a courtier's tongue for insulting me. "I love you," he said into the dark, so quietly I almost thought I imagined it. I did not think that was possible for something like me. I did not think I had that left to give. You have more of it than you know, I told him, tracing the fresh mark on my shoulder with trembling fingers. You've just never had anywhere safe to put it before. He laughed, a real laugh, rough and startled, the kind I had only heard from him a handful of times in all our months together. Somewhere safe, he repeated. Is that what you are to me now? I hope so, I said. I'd like to be. He pulled back just enough to look at me, ember eyes bright even in the darkness, and pressed his forehead to mine with a tenderness that still, months later, undoes something in my chest every time I think of it. You are the safest thing I have ever held, he said. I intend to keep it that way, whatever it costs me. I did not know, that night, exactly how literally he meant those words. I did not know how soon they would be tested. Quick pause here. If you want to watch our videos early with zero ads or get access to exclusive videos, our Patreon has you covered, link in the description. Alright, back to where things get interesting. Which brings me back to that hall, that silence, that instant when Brian King forgot how to breathe with his hand pressed against the place where our child was growing. For a long, suspended moment, neither of us moved. The torches hissed and guttered along the walls. Somewhere far off in the fortress, a bell tolled the hour, indifferent to the fact that the world had just tilted beneath us both. I watched his face cycle through disbelief, then something like terror, then an emotion so raw and unguarded that I finally understood, truly understood, what it meant to be someone's weakness. Say something, I echoed his own words back to him, my voice trembling. You're frightening me. His hand pressed more firmly against my stomach, as though he could feel the flutter through sheer will alone, as though proximity might make the impossible more real. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked in the middle, something I had never once heard happen to him, not during battle reports of slaughtered enemies, not during the bonding, not ever. A child, he breathed, ours. The healer confirmed it this morning, I said. I didn't know how to tell you, I was afraid. Afraid of what? His head snapped up, ember eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that stole the rest of my sentence from my throat. Afraid of me? Afraid of what this means, I corrected quickly, reaching up to cup his jaw, feeling the tension coiled beneath his skin. Male Omegas conceiving is rare enough to be considered a myth in most kingdoms. A demon lord's heir born from that kind of rarity. Brian, you know what your court will say. You know what they'll try to do. Something shifted behind his eyes. The demon lord returning, calculating, already 3 steps ahead of threats I had not yet fully articulated. But beneath that calculation, unmistakable and raw, the terror remained. Not terror of the child. Terror, I realized with a jolt, of losing me. No one touches you, he said, low and absolute, the words carrying a weight that made the torches along the wall seem to dim in response, as though even fire understood better than to argue with him. No one touches either of you. I don't care what old superstitions the court clings to, I don't care what it costs. Brian, I have spent 300 years being feared for what I could destroy. He gathered me against his chest with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with the raw power still churning in his voice. Let them learn finally what I will destroy to protect something instead. I pressed my face into his robes, breathing in the familiar scent of ash and rain that always clung to him, and let myself cry, not from fear anymore, but from the overwhelming relief of being wrong about how he would respond. I had spent the entire day braced for calculation, for cold political weighing of costs and benefits. Instead, I had gotten this. A demon lord on his knees in his own throne room, holding his Omega, like something infinitely breakable and infinitely precious. Murmuring promises against my hair that sounded less like a ruler's decree and more like a prayer. I was so afraid you'd see it as a liability, I admitted, voice muffled against his chest. Something to be managed instead of the single best thing that has happened to me in 3 centuries? He pulled back enough to tilt my chin up, thumb wiping fresh tears from my cheek. Nate, look at me. I told you the night I marked you that you were my weakness. I did not understand until this exact moment how much larger that weakness could grow. And I have never been more grateful for anything in my entire, miserable, endless life. I laughed through the tears, a wet, undignified sound, and he smiled. Actually smiled, that rare, unguarded expression he saved only for me. Before leaning down to press his lips to my forehead, then my temple, then finally, achingly soft my mouth. "We'll face whatever comes," he murmured against my lips. "Together, I promise you that." I wanted, desperately, to believe the promise would be simple to keep. I did not yet know how quickly the court would move against us, or how far certain members of his council were willing to go to ensure a male Omega's child never drew breath in Ashvale's halls. The council learned of the pregnancy 3 days later, and I have never in my life witnessed a room fall so completely, dangerously silent. Brian called the meeting himself, standing before his gathered advisors with me seated at his side, rather than kneeling behind him as tradition demanded. I felt the shift in the room the instant we entered together, the recalculation happening behind a dozen pairs of eyes, courtiers and generals alike, rearranging their understanding of where power in Ashvale actually lived. Voss, the general who had once cornered me in a stairwell to remind me of my place, was the first to speak, and I felt every muscle in Brian's arm go rigid beside me the moment the words left his mouth. "My lord," Voss said carefully, though carefully was not nearly careful enough, "surely you understand the complications such a pregnancy presents. Male Omegas do not carry to term. When they do, the histories are not kind about what results." "Explain," Brian said. His voice was calm in a way that I had learned, over months of watching him navigate this court, meant the opposite of calm underneath. "The old texts speak of instability," said another advisor, a thin, sharp-featured woman named Ilsera, who had never once looked at me with anything warmer than suspicion. "Children born of male Omega carriers are said to be unpredictable, volatile. Some accounts suggest they draw too heavily on their carrier's life force, leaving the Omega weakened beyond recovery. Others suggest the child itself inherits an instability of power that has, in past centuries, led entire courts to ruin." "Those are superstitions," Brian said, "recorded by scholars who feared what they did not understand." "Perhaps," Ilsera allowed, though her tone made clear she did not believe it. "But the court will hear these same old texts, my lord, whether we speak them here or not. Rumors of an unstable heir will spread with or without our permission. It would be safer to consider alternatives before the pregnancy progresses further." The word alternatives landed in that hall like a blade dropped onto stone. I felt my blood go cold, felt Brian's hand find mine beneath the table we sat behind, gripping tight enough that I understood without needing to look at his face exactly how close he was to losing the careful composure he had been holding on to. "Say what you mean," he said, plainly, "so there is no confusion about what you are suggesting to your lord's mate." Ilsera's jaw tightened, but she held her ground. "I will give her that much credit even now, even after everything that followed. I am suggesting, my lord, that the pregnancy be ended before it becomes a liability. The court cannot survive. For the Omega's safety. For yours." The silence that followed was absolute. I watched Brian rise from his seat slowly, deliberately, the temperature in the room seeming to drop with every inch he gained in height, until he towered over the assembled council like a coming storm given human, given demon shape. "Let me be clear," he said, and his voice, though quiet, carried into every corner of that hall with a force that made several advisors visibly flinch. "The child my mate carries is not a liability. It is not a political inconvenience to be weighed against convenience or old superstition. It is mine, it is his, and anyone in this room who speaks of ending that life again will discover exactly how unstable Ix become when threatened." "My lord, I only meant. I know exactly what you meant." He turned his gaze slowly across the assembled council, and I watched grown generals, men who had survived a dozen brutal campaigns, lower their eyes rather than meet his. "Hear me now, all of you. Nate Wong is bonded to me. The child he carries is my heir, regardless of what old texts claim about instability or ruin." I will hear no further discussion of ending this pregnancy. I will hear no further suggestion that his safety is a matter for this council to weigh against mine. Anyone who cannot accept those terms is welcome to leave Ashvale's service immediately. No one moved. No one spoke. I sat there, hands still clasped in his, watching my mate dismantle centuries of political precedent with nothing but the raw force of his fury and his devotion, and I understood more completely than I ever had before exactly what it meant to be loved by something the world had decided could not love at all. But I also understood something else, watching Ilsera's carefully schooled expression as she finally lowered her eyes and murmured a reluctant agreement. This was not over. Court advisors did not abandon dangerous convictions simply because their lord shouted them down in a single meeting. If anything, I suspected we had only driven the true danger into shadow, where it would fester and plot in silence rather than council chambers. I was right to suspect it. I only wish I had understood how quickly and how violently that silence would break. The attempt on my life came 6 weeks later in the quiet hour before dawn, when the fortress was at its stillest, and Brian had been called away to inspect a disturbance at the eastern border. A disturbance I now believe was engineered specifically to draw him from my side. I was in the garden. I know now how foolish that was, how careless, but I had grown restless in our chambers, and the black roses had become, over the months, something like a refuge for me, the way they had always been for him. I remember the night air was cool against my skin, my stomach rounded enough by then that I had taken to resting a hand against it, almost constantly feeling for the small, reassuring movements that had become the rhythm of my days. I did not hear the first attacker until it was almost too late. The blade caught the edge of my sleeve rather than my skin, a difference of perhaps an inch that I still think about more than I would like to admit. I stumbled backward into the rose bushes, thorns tearing into my forearms, and screamed. Not for myself in that first instant, but for the child. Some instinct deeper than thought, driving my arms to curl protectively around my stomach, even as a second attacker emerged from the shadows behind the first. They were court guards. That detail still turns my stomach whenever I think of it. Not foreign assassins, not hired blades from some rival kingdom, but men who had sworn service to Ashvale, who had likely stood watch outside my own chambers on countless unremarkable nights, turned suddenly into instruments meant to end my life and my child's before either of us drew another breath. "The council has decided," one of them said, almost apologetically, as though that made what he intended somehow less monstrous. "This ends tonight, for the good of the court." I do not remember deciding to run. I remember only the desperate, animal need to put distance between myself and the blades, stumbling through rose bushes that tore at my skin, screaming for guards I did not know would come, for Brian, for anyone. I remember the second attacker catching my ankle and dragging me down onto the stone path. Remember the terror of feeling the ground rush up to meet me and thinking with a clarity that still haunts my dreams. Not the baby. Please, not the baby. All waits I. What saved me in the end was not a guard's timely arrival or my own strength. It was the bond. I have since learned that a sufficiently strong mating bond can carry more than emotion across distance. In moments of extreme danger, it can carry raw, unfiltered terror, a scream translated not through sound, but through soul. Brian told me afterward that he felt it like a blade through his own chest, felt my fear rip through the bond with such violence that he abandoned the border inspection mid-sentence and tore through the sky faster than any of his generals had ever seen him move. Faster, he admitted later, than he had believed himself capable of moving. He arrived as the second attacker raised his blade for what would have been the final strike. I do not fully remember what happened next. I remember darkness unfurling from Brian's shoulders like wings made of smoke and screaming. Remember the air itself seeming to catch fire with the force of his rage. Remember a sound tearing from his throat that was not quite a roar and not quite a word, something older and more primal than language. I remember the attackers were simply gone within seconds, not fled, not surrendered, gone in a way I chose afterward not to ask too many questions about. And I remember Brian's hands on me, shaking, more gentle than I had ever felt them despite the violence still radiating off him in waves, checking every inch of me with a desperation that bordered on frantic. "I'm all right," I kept telling him, though my voice shook too badly to be convincing. "I'm all right, Brian. The baby's all right, please. Look at me. I'm all right." "You could have died." His voice broke completely on the words, all pretense of demon lord composure abandoned entirely. "You could have died, and I was an hour away chasing a border skirmish that never should have taken me from your side. It's not your fault. It is exactly my fault." He gathered me against his chest with a care that felt like it might shatter him, pressing his face into my hair, and I felt something wet against my scalp that I understood with a jolt. To be tears, the demon lord who had never wept for anything in 3 centuries, weeping now for me. "I promised you safety. I promised you I would protect you both, whatever it cost. I failed that promise the moment I let a manufactured border dispute pull me away from you." "You came," I whispered, clutching at his robes with hands still trembling from thorns and terror alike. "You came the instant you knew." "That's not failure, Brian. That's everything." He did not answer with words. He simply held me tighter, and beneath the fury still simmering in him, beneath the raw devastation of having nearly lost us both, I felt something else solidifying, a resolve so absolute it seemed to reshape the very air around him. Whoever had ordered this attack, whoever on his council had decided my death and our child's death were acceptable costs for stability, was about to learn exactly how far a demon lord's supposed weakness could actually reach. The investigation that followed was swift and merciless, and I will not pretend I felt much sympathy for its conclusion. It took Brian less than 2 days to trace the guards' orders back to their source, a chain of quiet payments and quieter promises that led, unsurprisingly, to Ilsera's chambers. She did not deny it when he confronted her in front of the full council, did not even attempt the careful diplomatic language she had used weeks earlier to suggest ending my pregnancy. Perhaps she understood there was no version of denial that would save her. Perhaps, in some twisted way, she believed herself justified enough not to bother pretending otherwise. "You would risk everything," she said, chin lifted despite the tremor in her voice, "for an Omega and a child that could unmake this entire court if the old texts are correct." "I would risk everything," Brian said, "for my mate and my child, regardless of what any text claims. That is the entire point you have failed, repeatedly, to understand. You do not get to weigh their lives against your comfort. You never did. I was not in the room for what happened next, and I have chosen, deliberately, not to ask for details. I know only that Ilsera did not remain in Ashvale's service, and that no member of the council has since dared to raise the subject of ending my pregnancy, not even in whispers, not even in the careful, deniable language courtiers use when they think no one important is listening. What I remember more clearly than the reckoning is what came after. The weeks of careful, almost reverent protection Brian wrapped around me like a second skin. He assigned guards personally selected and tested for loyalty. Guards who answered only to him and had sworn oaths sealed with old magic that made betrayal physically impossible. He moved our chambers to the highest tower in the fortress, accessible only through a single heavily warded stairwell. He began attending council meetings with me, seated beside him, as a matter of unshakable routine, making it plain to every remaining advisor that any decision affecting the court now ran, unavoidably, through the space where I sat. But it was the small things that undid me more than the grand political maneuvering, the way he took to resting his hand against my stomach every night before sleep, murmuring words in the old demon tongue that he refused for weeks to translate for me. The way he learned, without being asked, exactly which foods settled my stomach during the difficult mornings and which made the nausea worse. The way he began humming, low and rough and entirely unpracticed, some tuneless melody against my hair whenever the fear crept back into my chest late at night and refused to let me sleep. "What are you saying to the baby?" I finally asked him, one quiet evening when his lips had been moving softly against my stomach for the better part of an hour, the old demon words rolling out low and warm. He was silent for a long moment, and I thought perhaps he would deflect the question the way he sometimes did when a topic touched too close to something vulnerable in him. Instead, he lifted his head, ember eyes soft in the candlelight, and answered with a quiet honesty that still makes my chest ache to remember. I'm telling them they are already loved more than anything I have ever held in 300 years, he said. I'm telling them their father was a monster before their carrier arrived, and that I intend to spend whatever remains of my long, miserable existence making certain neither of you ever has cause to doubt that love again. I could not speak past the lump in my throat. I simply reached down, threaded my fingers through his dark hair, and pulled him up to press my forehead against his, letting the silence say what words could not. You were never a monster, I whispered finally. Not to me, not even at the beginning. I was exactly a monster, he corrected gently. You simply arrived and decided to love me anyway. That is not the same as innocence, Nate. That is grace, and I intend to spend the rest of my existence earning it. The months that followed were not without difficulty. There were more whispers, more careful political maneuvering from advisors too cowardly to speak their doubts aloud after Ilsera's fate. More nights where fear crept back in, and I found myself pressing a palm against my rounding stomach and praying to gods I was not entirely sure existed that we would both survive whatever the old texts claimed awaited male Omega carriers at the end. But there was also this, a demon lord learning, clumsily and completely, how to be gentle. A fortress built on fear slowly, quietly, learning to bend around a single fragile life growing beneath my heart. I clung to that gentleness through every difficult night that followed. I did not yet know how badly it would be tested when my time finally came. There is one more memory from those months I want to set down before I tell you about the night Elowen was born, because it is the memory I return to most often when I doubt whether any of this was real, whether a demon lord truly softened for someone like me, or whether I have simply chosen, in hindsight, to remember him kinder than he was. It happened during my 7th month on a night when the fear had crept back in worse than usual. When my body ached in ways I did not have words for, and my mind kept circling back to Ilsera's warnings about instability and ruin despite everything that had happened since, I could not sleep. I lay awake beside Brian, staring at the dark canopy above our bed, one hand pressed to the curve of my stomach, feeling Elowen shift restlessly inside me as though she too sensed the anxiety I could not shake. Brian woke without my meaning to wake him. Some instinct through the bond, I think, alerting him to distress even in his sleep. Tell me, he said, voice thick with sleep but already alert, already turning toward me in the dark. Whatever it is, tell me. I keep thinking about what happens if the old texts are right, I admitted, the words spilling out before I could stop them, months of carefully swallowed fear finally cracking loose. What if something goes wrong? What if I can't? My voice broke. What if I can't give her to you safely, Brian? What if all of this ends in exactly the tragedy your counsel warned about? He was silent for a long moment, and I braced myself for reassurances I would not entirely believe, the kind of soft platitudes people offer when they do not actually know how to fix the thing that's broken. Instead, he did something I did not expect. He sat up, gathered me carefully against his chest, and told me, for the first time, about his mother. She died bringing me into this world, he said quietly. Not from instability, not from any curse the old texts warn of, simply from the ordinary, brutal danger of childbirth, the kind that claims mothers and carriers regardless of what blood runs through their veins. My father never forgave me for it. He raised me believing I was the reason he lost the only soft thing he had left, and by the time I inherited this throne, I had learned to believe I was cursed to destroy whatever I loved most. Brian. Let me finish. His arms tightened around me, his chin resting against my hair. I did not tell you this before because I did not want my own fear bleeding into yours. But I need you to understand something, Nate. I have spent 300 years terrified of exactly this moment, of loving someone enough to lose them the way my father lost my mother. And I chose you anyway. I chose this child anyway. Not because I am not afraid, but because the alternative, never having you at all, Never having Eloin at all frightens me infinitely more than the risk does. I turned in his arms, pressing my palm flat against his chest, feeling his heart beating fast and unsteady beneath my hand. We're going to be afraid together then, I said. Both of us, every step of this. Together, he agreed, voice rough. I would rather be terrified beside you than safe without you. I learned that lesson the night those guards nearly took you from me in the garden. I will not unlearn it now. We stayed awake most of that night, trading fears we had both been too proud or too frightened to voice aloud, and somewhere in the exhausted, tender hours before dawn, I finally understood something I had been circling for months without quite grasping it, that love, real love, was not the absence of fear. It was choosing, deliberately and repeatedly, to stand inside that fear with someone rather than retreat from it alone. Brian had spent 3 centuries retreating from exactly this kind of vulnerability, convinced it would only ever end in loss. And here he was, wide awake at some impossible hour, choosing me and our unborn daughter instead, fear and all. I fell asleep eventually with his hand resting over mine on my stomach, both of us guarding the small, restless life between us, and I did not dream of instability or old curses that night. I dreamed only of gardens and rain and roses that bloomed for exactly the people brave enough to tend them. The labor began on a night thick with an unnatural storm, lightning splitting the bruised sky over Ashvale in jagged white scars. And I remember thinking, even through the first wave of pain, that the timing felt less like coincidence and more like some old cruel design. I was right to suspect it. The healer, a different one, now an older woman named Mirith, who had earned Brian's trust through months of careful, unwavering loyalty, was at my side within minutes. Her weathered hands already moving with practiced efficiency, despite the fear I could see flickering behind her calm expression. Male Omega births were rare enough that even she, with all her decades of experience, had attended only a handful in her lifetime. I saw that fear and understood, with a jolt of my own terror, that we were entering territory none of us could fully prepare for. "Send for my lord," Mirith instructed one of the guards sharply. "Now." Not after the delivery. Now. Brian arrived before she finished the sentence, having felt, through the bond, the exact instant pain began tearing through my body in earnest. He did not bother with formality or composure, simply crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees beside the bed, taking my hand in both of his with a grip that would have hurt if I hadn't needed the anchor of it so desperately. "I'm here," he said. "I'm here, Nate. I'm not leaving. Whatever happens, I am not leaving this room." The hours that followed blurred together in my memory into a haze of pain and fear, and Brian's voice, steady even when his hands were not, murmuring encouragement against my temple, my hair, my knuckles white in his grip. I remember Mirith's growing tension as the labor stretched longer than she expected, her murmured consultations with the 2 assistants she had brought. Words like unusual and the old texts warned of this, slipping through despite her obvious attempts to keep them from reaching my ears. Then the storm outside seemed to answer something inside me, and the pain sharpened into something I did not have language for, a wrongness sudden and absolute, that had nothing to do with the ordinary agony of childbirth, and everything to do with a magic I could feel gathering in the room like static before lightning strikes. "Something's happening," Mirith said, voice tight with an alarm she could no longer disguise. "The child is drawing on him too heavily. My lord, this is what the old text warned of, the instability. We need to." "Fix it," Brian snarled, but even his fury could not disguise the terror underneath it. "Whatever you need, take it from me instead. I don't care what it costs." "It doesn't work that way," Mirith said, already moving, already pressing hands glowing faintly with old healing magic against my stomach. "The bond between carrier and child cannot simply be redirected, my lord. I do not remember losing consciousness so much as I remember the room tilting sideways." Brian's voice growing distant, even as his grip on my hand tightened, as though he could physically hold me to the world through sheer force of will. I remember his face twisted with a fear more absolute than anything I had witnessed even during the assassination attempt, and I remember thinking with strange clarity, even as darkness closed in, that I wished I could tell him one more time that none of this was his fault. What happened next, I know only from what Brian told me afterward, his voice still rough with remembered terror whenever he recounts it. He tells me that when Mirith's magic began to fail against whatever ancient instability the old texts had warned of, when my heartbeat began to falter beneath her healing hands, something in him broke open that had been sealed shut for 3 centuries. He tells me the room filled with a darkness that had nothing to do with the storm outside, power tearing loose from wherever he had kept it leashed and controlled for the entirety of his long, careful, monstrous reign. He tells me he did not think, did not calculate, did not weigh costs the way a demon lord is trained to weigh every decision. He simply reached for the bond connecting us and poured everything he was into it, every drop of power. Every century of carefully hoarded strength holding nothing back, because for the first time in 300 years, there was nothing he valued more than what he stood to lose. Mirith told me afterward that she had never witnessed magic like it. Raw, desperate, utterly without the careful structure demon lords are taught to maintain even in their most powerful workings. She said it should have destroyed him, burning through his reserves so completely and so fast. She said the only reason it did not was because he did not care, in that moment, whether it did. I woke to the sound of a child crying thin and furious and absolutely perfectly alive, and to Brian's face above mine, wet with tears, he did not bother trying to hide, holding our daughter against his chest with hands that trembled from more than exhaustion. "You're here," he breathed, when my eyes finally focused on his face. "You're both here, Brian." My voice came out cracked and hoarse, but I managed to lift a shaking hand toward him, toward the small, impossibly perfect creature wrapped in his arms. "Is she?" "She's perfect," he said, and something in his voice broke entirely on the word, 300 years of careful composure dissolving completely as he pressed his forehead against mine, our daughter's small cries settling into soft, sleepy murmurs between us. "She's perfect, and she's ours, and you're alive, you're both alive. I don't know what I would have." "You didn't have to find out," I whispered, pressing a trembling kiss to his jaw, the only part of him I could reach. "You saved us, both of us." "I would have burned this entire fortress to the ground," he said, voice raw, "if it meant keeping either of you breathing one more hour." I believed him completely. I still do. The days that followed the birth passed in a haze of exhaustion, and a happiness so complete it frightened me, in quiet moments, with its own fragility. I had spent so many months bracing for disaster that I did not entirely know how to exist in the absence of it. How to simply lie in a warm bed with my daughter asleep against my chest and my mate's arm curled protectively around us, both without some part of me waiting for the next threat to reveal itself. Brian noticed, of course. He noticed everything about me by then, 3 seasons of careful attention having taught him the exact shape of my fears, even when I did not voice them aloud. "She's safe," he murmured one evening, watching me watch our daughter's small chest rise and fall in sleep. "You're both safe. I know it doesn't feel real yet. It will." "I keep waiting for something to go wrong," I admitted quietly. "I don't know how to stop." "Then wait with me," he said, pressing a kiss to my temple. "I'll keep waiting beside you until it finally feels safe to stop." He named her Elowen, after his mother, a woman I never met, who died. He told me once in a rare, unguarded moment, long before he became the demon lord the world now feared. He told me she had been gentle in a way the court had beaten out of him over centuries of survival, and that naming our daughter after her felt like reclaiming something he had thought lost forever. The court's reaction to Elowen's birth was, as expected, divided. There were those who saw an unstable magic in her that made them uneasy, whispers that had not entirely died despite Ylcera's fall from power. But there were also those, more than I expected, more than Brian himself seemed to expect, who saw in her small, fierce presence something the court had been missing for a very long time, proof that Ashvale could hold tenderness alongside strength, that a demon lord's reign did not require the absence of love to remain absolute. Brian presented her to the full court 3 weeks after her birth, standing on the same dais where he had once knelt to press his hand against my stomach and forget how to breathe. He held her with a gentleness that silenced every skeptic in the room more effectively than any threat could have. Ember eyes, soft and fierce in equal measure, as he addressed the assembled advisors, generals, and courtiers who had spent months debating whether our child's existence would be Ashvale's ruin or its renewal. "This is my daughter," he said, voice carrying easily through the silent hall. "She is proof that everything you believed about weakness was wrong. I have never been more powerful, more certain, more absolutely resolved than I am standing here today with her in my arms and her carrier at my side." Let the old texts say what they will about instability. I say this court has never been more stable, because for the first time in 300 years, I finally have something worth being unbreakable for. I stood beside him, Eloan's small hand curled around my finger, and felt the last lingering fear in my chest finally, quietly settle. Not because every danger had vanished. Courts like Ashvale do not become gentle places overnight, and I suspected there would always be some corner of shadow willing to test the boundaries of what my family could survive. But because I understood watching my mate hold our daughter before a hall that had once seen me as nothing more than tribute, that whatever came next, we would face it exactly as he had promised in that first quiet moment after learning I carried his child. Together. It has been a year now since Eloan's birth, and I find myself, more often than not, back in that garden of black roses where everything between Brian and me first began. I sit there in the evenings with our daughter dozing against my shoulder, watching petals catch the last light of sunset, and I think about the frightened tribute Omega who arrived at these gates in chains, certain he had been delivered into nothing but a slow, inevitable ending. I was wrong about so much that first terrified night. I was wrong about the demon lord being a monster without a single soft place left in him. I was wrong about love being something reserved for people luckier or safer or less broken than either of us. I was wrong about weakness being something to fear rather than something to treasure when it is offered freely, when it is chosen rather than forced. Brian finds me there most evenings, drawn by the bond that still hums quietly between us even after everything we have survived together. He settles beside me among the roses, one arm curling around my shoulders while the other reaches instinctively for our daughter's small hand, and for a long while neither of us speaks, content simply to exist together in the quiet. "They still call me the Undefeated," he said to me recently, watching Eloan's small fingers curl around his clawed hand with a tenderness that never fails to undo something in my chest. The Devourer of Kingdoms. They still tell children's stories meant to frighten them into obedience. "Does it bother you?" I asked, "being feared even now?" "No," he said after a moment's thought. "Let them fear the demon lord. Let them tell whatever stories keep them cautious and careful around Ashvale's borders. I know what I actually am now when the throne room empties and the crown comes off." He turned to look at me then, ember eyes soft in the fading light, full of a devotion that still, after everything, catches me by surprise. "I am the man who found the last soft place in himself in a garden full of roses, and gave it, completely, to an Omega brave enough to stay." I leaned into him, Eloan stirring softly against my shoulder, and let the quiet certainty of that truth settle over me like the last warmth of the setting sun. They say the demon lord had no weaknesses. They say he conquered kingdoms without mercy and ruled without ever once bending to anything softer than his own iron will. Perhaps, once, all of that was true. But I know the truth the rest of the world will never see. That somewhere beneath the throne, beneath the crown of curling horns and the reputation built on fear, there lived a heart simply waiting for someone worth being unbreakable for. I found that heart in a garden, in the rain, among roses that bloomed only for him, and in return, he gave me everything. His devotion, his protection, his daughter, his entire impossible, unbreakable love. The demon lord of Ashvale had no weaknesses. Then I arrived, carrying his child beneath my heart, and became his only one. And he has spent every day since proving, to a court that once thought him incapable of tenderness, exactly how far an unbreakable love can reach when it finally has something worth protecting. I would not trade that truth for any safety the world outside these black gates could have offered me instead. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe. Comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon, link is in the description. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.